The dark clouds loomed over Pine Valley Funeral Home on that Tuesday morning, matching the somber mood of the gathered mourners. Sarah Mitchell stood at the back of the room, her 16-year-old frame almost hidden behind a large floral arrangement. Her black dress felt too tight around her neck, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking as they clutched her grandmother's worn leather diary inside her purse. The funeral home's main hall was packed with over 100 people. Some were dabbing their eyes with tissues, while others whispered quietly among themselves about what a wonderful woman Eleanor Mitchell had been. The sweet scent of lilies, her grandmother's favorite flowers, filled the air, making Sarah feel slightly dizzy. Her father, Thomas Mitchell, stood at the podium, his usually confident voice trembling as he began his eulogy. "My mother, Eleanor Mitchell, was more than just a parent. She was a beacon of light in our community," he said, adjusting his black tie nervously. Sarah watched as he pulled out his reading glasses, noting how much older he looked today, his face lined with grief. From her position at the back, Sarah could see her Aunt Patricia in the front row, sobbing dramatically into her husband's shoulder. Next to her sat Uncle Robert, his face stern and unmoving, just like always. The rest of the family filled the first 3 rows. Cousins, second cousins, and elderly relatives Sarah only saw at holidays and funerals. The weight of what she knew pressed heavily on Sarah's chest. Her fingers traced the outline of the diary in her purse, feeling the rough edges of the papers she had tucked inside. Photocopies of documents that told a very different story about her grandmother's last days. The truth felt like a stone in her stomach, growing heavier with each word of her father's speech. Mom spent her final months in peaceful reflection at Sunny Grove Nursing Home, Thomas continued, his words making Sarah's jaw clench. The staff there took such good care of her, treating her like family until her final moments. Sarah's best friend, Jenny Thompson, who stood beside her, noticed her tension and squeezed her hand gently. Jenny was the only person who knew what Sarah had discovered, the only one who had helped her piece together the disturbing puzzle over the past 2 weeks. The memories of finding the metal box in grandmother Eleanor's attic came flooding back. Sarah had been helping clean out the house when she noticed the loose floorboard. Inside the hidden space was a locked box, and after hours of searching, she found the key taped behind an old photograph in Eleanor's bedroom. As her father continued speaking about Eleanor's love for gardening and her famous apple pies, Sarah's mind wandered to the contents of that box. The diary entries started normally enough, daily observations about life at Sunny Grove, comments about the other residents, notes about the staff, but 3 months in, the tone changed dramatically. Sarah glanced around the room, studying the faces of the mourners. Near the middle sat Mrs. Henderson, the head nurse from Sunny Grove, her face a perfect mask of grief. The sight of her made Sarah's blood boil. 2 rows behind her was Dr. Phillips, the nursing home's director who had signed Eleanor's death certificate citing natural causes. Thunder rumbled outside, and rain began pattering against the funeral home's large windows. Sarah watched as her father wiped his eyes, approaching the end of his speech. Her younger brother, Mike, sat in the front row, looking uncomfortable in his new suit, while her mother, Karen, tried to comfort him. The family photos displayed around Eleanor's casket showed a vibrant woman who loved life. Eleanor at her garden club meetings, Eleanor hosting Christmas dinners, Eleanor laughing at Sarah's last birthday party. But the final photo, taken at Sunny Grove just a month before her death, showed a different person, someone worried, alert, and afraid. Sarah's throat felt dry as her father neared the end of his eulogy. In her final days, Thomas said, his voice breaking slightly, Mom was at peace. She died quietly in her sleep, surrounded by the caring staff who had become her second family. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She knew the truth. Her grandmother's last diary entry proved it. Eleanor had been anything but peaceful. She had been terrified, desperate to expose what she had discovered. The entry, dated just 1 day before her death, spoke of gathering final proof and contacting authorities tomorrow. Tomorrow never came for Eleanor Mitchell. Sarah felt the weight of the diary in her purse grow heavier. As the eulogy concluded and the minister stepped forward to begin the final prayers, she knew her moment of truth was approaching. The shocking revelation she carried would change everything, for her family, for Sunny Grove, and for the memory of her beloved grandmother. 2 weeks before the funeral, Sarah's life had changed forever on a rainy Saturday afternoon. The task of clearing out her grandmother's house had fallen to the family, and Sarah had volunteered to tackle the attic. The old Victorian home's top floor was filled with decades of memories, covered in a thick layer of dust. The attic air was heavy and warm as Sarah moved between stacked boxes and old furniture. Her ponytail was damp with sweat, and dust covered her blue t-shirt. She had been working for 3 hours, sorting through Christmas decorations and old photo albums, when something unusual caught her eye. "What's this?" Sarah muttered to herself, noticing how one floorboard seemed slightly higher than the others. She ran her fingers along its edge, feeling it move slightly under her touch. Using a screwdriver from her father's toolbox, she carefully pried up the board. The hidden space beneath was dark, but Sarah's foam flashlight revealed a metal box about the size of a thick textbook. It was old but sturdy, with a small keyhole on the front. Her heart began beating faster. Her grandmother, always so open and honest, had kept something hidden. "Sarah? How's it going up there?" Her father's voice called from downstairs. "Fine, Dad. Just going through some old books," she called back, quickly taking a photo of the box on her phone. She knew she needed to find the key before showing this to anyone else. Something in her gut told her this was important. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Sarah convinced her parents to let her stay and finish organizing some boxes. As soon as they left, she began a systematic search of her grandmother's bedroom. She checked jewelry boxes, drawers, and every possible hiding place she could think of. Hours passed, and Sarah was about to give up when she noticed a slight bulge behind the backing of an old family photograph. Her hands trembled as she carefully removed the frame from the wall. There, taped to the back, was a small silver key. Back in the attic, Sarah's heart pounded as she inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. Inside the box, she found several folders, a small notebook, and her grandmother's diary, bound in worn brown leather. The first few pages of the diary seemed normal enough. Eleanor wrote about moving into Sunny Grove Nursing Home, describing her new room and her daily routines. She mentioned kind nurses and friendly residents. But as Sarah continued reading, the entries took a dark turn. "Something isn't right here," Eleanor had written 3 months before her death. "Mrs. Jenkins disappeared last night. They say she was transferred to the hospital, but her daughter wasn't notified until this morning. And her room was completely cleaned out before dawn." Sarah pulled out her phone and called Jenny, her best friend since 3rd grade. "Jenny, I need you to come over right now. And don't tell anyone where you're going." 30 minutes later, Jenny sat cross-legged on the attic floor beside Sarah, reading through the diary entries. "This is seriously messed up," Jenny whispered, her eyes wide. "Your grandmother was investigating the nursing home?" Sarah nodded, spreading out the documents from the folders. There were medication charts, staff schedules, and notes about unusual patterns. Eleanor had been methodically documenting everything she observed. "Look at this entry." Sarah pointed to a page dated just 2 weeks before her grandmother's death. 3 residents died in 1 week, all with similar symptoms. Grandma wrote that their medical records were changed after they died. Jenny picked up another document. She was taking photos too. These show different medications than what's listed in the official charts. Her hand shook slightly as she passed the paper to Sarah. The girls spent hours in the attic that night, organizing the evidence and making copies of everything. Eleanor's final entries grew increasingly urgent, describing late-night meetings between staff members and suspicious changes in resident care patterns. "I have proof now. Read the last entry, dated the day before Eleanor died. Tomorrow I'm calling the authorities. I can't stay silent any longer. What they're doing here is criminal." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she read those words again. She looked at Jenny, who had gone pale. "Your grandmother?" Jenny said slowly. "She never got the chance to make that call, did she?" The rain continued to pour outside the attic window as Sarah shook her head. "No," she whispered. "She died that night. And now I know why." She carefully placed the diary and copies of the documents into her backpack. The truth about Sunny Grove Nursing Home had died with her grandmother, but not for long. Sarah knew what she had to do. The upcoming funeral would bring everyone together, including those responsible for her grandmother's death. It would be the perfect time to reveal everything. The week following Sarah's discovery in the attic turned into a nightmare of sleepless nights and secret investigations. Every evening, after her parents thought she was asleep, She sat in her bedroom with a small reading light, studying her grandmother's diary entries over and over again. Jenny came over every day after school to help. The two girls spread their evidence across Sarah's bedroom floor, using sticky notes and string to connect different events on a large poster board, just like they'd seen detectives do in movies. Sarah's mother had noticed the dark circles under her daughter's eyes but assumed it was just grief over losing her grandmother. "Look at this pattern," Sarah said to Jenny on Thursday night, pointing to their timeline. Every time a resident complained about the wrong medications, they either died or were suddenly transferred within a week. Jenny leaned closer, adjusting her glasses. "And all the deaths were at night," she added, "when that same nurse, Mrs. Henderson, was on duty." The girls had created a detailed spreadsheet of all the information from Eleanor's diary. There were 12 suspicious deaths in just 4 months, all with similar patterns. Eleanor had even managed to take photos of medication labels that didn't match the prescriptions in patients' files. Sarah couldn't sleep that night, thinking about her grandmother's courage. Eleanor had pretended to be confused and forgetful, but all the while, she was gathering evidence. She had earned the staff's trust so completely that they didn't notice her watching, documenting, and investigating. The next day, Sarah decided to visit Sunny Grove Nursing Home herself. She told her parents she wanted to collect her grandmother's remaining belongings, but her real mission was different. Jenny waited in the car across the street, ready to call Sarah's parents if anything went wrong. The nursing home's bright fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell made Sarah's stomach turn. She walked past the front desk, where a young receptionist was busy on the phone. Several elderly residents sat in the common room, watching TV or playing cards. "Sarah, dear, how nice to see you." Mrs. Henderson's sugary sweet voice made Sarah freeze. The head nurse approached, wearing her usual pink scrubs. "Are you here for your grandmother's things?" Sarah forced a smile, remembering what her grandmother had written about Mrs. Henderson's late-night activities. "Yes," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'd also like to see her room one last time, if that's okay." Mrs. Henderson's smile flickered for just a second. "Of course, sweetie, though we've already cleaned it out for the next resident." Following the nurse down the hallway, Sarah noticed security cameras in the corners. Her grandmother had mentioned them in her diary, how they mysteriously stopped working on nights when residents died. Eleanor's old room was now empty except for basic furniture. Sarah pretended to wipe away tears while actually examining every detail. The window that her grandmother had described in her diary, the one she saw suspicious deliveries through, had a clear view of the parking lot. "Your grandmother was so happy here," Mrs. Henderson said, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder that made her skin crawl. "She never complained about anything." "No," Sarah replied quietly. She was good at keeping secrets. That evening, Sarah and Jenny made their final preparations. They'd organized all the evidence into clear, easy-to-understand sections. Sarah made 3 complete copies of everything, hiding them in different places. She even mailed one set to Jenny's house, just to be safe. "Are you sure you want to do this at the funeral?" Jenny asked, helping Sarah sort the final batch of photos. "It's going to cause a huge scene." Sarah looked at the last photo taken of her grandmother. Eleanor sitting in her nursing home room, smiling bravely despite knowing the danger she was in. "They thought she was just a confused old lady," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "They didn't expect her to be documenting everything. And now they think their secret died with her." Jenny hugged her friend tightly. "You're as brave as she was. You know that?" That night, Sarah wrote her own diary entry, detailing everything she had learned and done. She sealed it in an envelope and gave it to Jenny for safekeeping. Tomorrow was the funeral, and Sarah knew she would need all her courage to face what was coming. As she finally lay down to sleep, Sarah whispered into the darkness, "I'll finish what you started, Grandma. I promise they won't get away with this." The morning of the funeral grew darker as Sarah's father reached the end of his eulogy. Her hands were sweating as they gripped her grandmother's diary, and her heart felt like it might burst from her chest. The time had come to reveal everything. "And so, we say goodbye to a wonderful mother, grandmother, and friend," Thomas Mitchell's voice cracked with emotion, "who left us peacefully in her sleep at Sunny Grove, surrounded by caring staff who—" "No," Sarah's voice rang out through the funeral home. A single word echoed off the walls, causing everyone to turn and stare at her. She stepped forward from her position at the back, her black shoes clicking against the wooden floor in the sudden silence. Mrs. Henderson, sitting in the middle rows, straightened up. Dr. Phillips, the nursing home director, turned to watch Sarah with narrowed eyes. The rest of the mourners looked shocked, some with their mouths hanging open. "Sarah Mitchell, sit down right now," her mother whispered urgently, her face turning red with embarrassment. But Sarah kept walking, moving straight to the front of the room. Jenny, still at the back, held her breath as she watched her best friend approach the podium. "I'm sorry, Dad," Sarah said, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. "But I can't let you finish that speech. Grandma didn't die peacefully, and Sunny Grove isn't what everyone thinks it is." Thomas Mitchell stepped back from the podium, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. "Sarah, this isn't the time or place for." "It's exactly the time and place," Sarah interrupted, pulling out Eleanor's diary. "Because Grandma wanted everyone to know the truth. She was murdered to keep her quiet." Gasps filled the room. Aunt Patricia dropped her tissue. Uncle Robert stood up, his face red. "Young lady, that's enough," he bellowed. Sarah opened the diary with trembling fingers. "2 weeks ago, I found this in Grandma's attic. Listen to what she wrote the day before she died." She began to read. "Tonight I saw them bringing in unmarked packages through the back door again. Mrs. Henderson changed Mr. Peterson's medication charts after he died, just like the others. I have all the evidence now. The photos, the real medical records, everything. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling the police." Mrs. Henderson suddenly stood up. "This is ridiculous. That poor girl is clearly struggling with grief." She started moving toward the exit, but Jenny quickly blocked the door. "The police are already on their way," Jenny announced loudly. "They've been watching Sunny Grove since we sent them copies of everything last week." Dr. Phillips jumped to his feet. "This is absurd." Eleanor Mitchell was a confused old woman who was smart enough to document everything, Sarah cut in. She pulled out a stack of papers from her bag. 12 deaths in 4 months, all during Mrs. Henderson's night shifts, all with changed medical records. Grandma took pictures of everything. The funeral home erupted into chaos. Some people were crying, others shouting. Sarah's father grabbed the papers with shaking hands, his face growing pale as he read them. My mother tried to tell me something was wrong," he whispered, "but I thought she was just having trouble adjusting." Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air. Through the funeral home windows, everyone could see police cars pulling up outside. Mrs. Henderson made another move for the door, but 2 mourners, cousins who worked as security guards, blocked her path. "Sarah," her mother's voice was barely a whisper as she joined them at the front. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" In response, Sarah played a recording on her phone, her grandmother's voice, secretly recorded during her final days. "They think nobody notices. They think we're all too old and confused to understand. But I see everything. And soon, everyone will know the truth." The police entered the funeral home just as Dr. Phillips tried to run. They'd already had warrants, not just for arrests, but to seize all records at Sunny Grove Nursing Home. As officers led Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Phillips away in handcuffs, Sarah finally let her tears fall. She placed her grandmother's diary gently beside the casket and whispered, "I did it, Grandma. I kept my promise." Thomas Mitchell wrapped his arms around his daughter, his own tears flowing freely now. "Your grandmother," he said softly, "would be so proud of you." The funeral had turned into something else entirely, not just a goodbye, but the beginning of justice. The next 2 hours at Pine Valley Funeral Home turned into a scene of controlled chaos. Police officers moved efficiently through the crowd, taking statements from shocked family members while crime scene investigators carefully collected Eleanor's diary and all the evidence Sarah had brought. Detective Maria Rodriguez, a seasoned officer with kind eyes but a firm expression, sat with Sarah and her parents in a small private room off the main hall. The sounds of confused and angry voices still drifted in from the main funeral area. "You did the right thing coming to us last week with copies of everything," Detective Rodriguez said, looking at Sarah with respect. "It gave us time to start our investigation quietly." She opened her laptop and showed them surveillance photos of nighttime activities at Sunny Grove. Sarah's mother, Karen, hadn't stopped crying since the revelation. "I can't believe we put Eleanor in that place," she sobbed, clutching her husband's hand. We thought we were doing the best for her. Thomas Mitchell sat in stunned silence, still holding some of the papers Sarah had brought. His face had aged 10 years in the last hour as he read through his mother's detailed accounts of what had really happened at Sunny Grove. "Dad," Sarah said softly, touching his arm. "Grandma wrote about trying to tell you. She knew you were busy with work, and they made her seem confused whenever you visited." Outside the room, they could hear Jenny giving her statement to another officer. She explained how she had helped Sarah make copies of everything and had kept one set at her house for safety. The sound of more sirens announced the arrival of news vans. The story was getting out. "What happens now?" Thomas finally asked, his voice hoarse. Detective Rodriguez closed her notebook. "We've already raided Sunny Grove. Based on your grandmother's evidence and our investigation, we're finding exactly what she documented: falsified medical records, unauthorized medications, and evidence of systematic elder abuse." Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with messages from relatives. Some were angry about the funeral disruption, but most were in shock about the revelations. Aunt Patricia had fainted and was being treated by paramedics, while Uncle Robert was outside giving an emotional interview to reporters. "There's something else you should know," Detective Rodriguez added, pulling out another folder. "After Sarah contacted us, we connected Eleanor's evidence to similar complaints at 3 other nursing homes owned by the same company. This is much bigger than just Sunny Grove." The weight of this information hit Sarah hard. Her grandmother hadn't just uncovered one facility's crimes, she had helped expose an entire criminal network. Tears filled her eyes as she thought about how brave Eleanor had been, pretending to be a helpless old woman while gathering evidence. A young officer knocked and entered the room. "Detective, we've finished processing the main hall. The family can proceed with the funeral if they wish." He paused. "And ma'am, there are several other families from Sunny Grove outside. They want to talk to Sarah." Karen wiped her eyes. "Maybe we should postpone the rest of the service," she suggested, but Sarah shook her head. "No, Mom. Grandma deserves to be honored today more than ever," Sarah said firmly. "She was a hero." Detective Rodriguez stood up, gathering her papers. "We'll need all of you to come to the station tomorrow for formal statements. For now, take time to be with your family. Officers will remain outside to ensure everyone's safety." As they walked back to the main hall, Sarah saw Jenny waiting for her. The two girls hugged tightly. "I can't believe we really did it," Jenny whispered. The funeral home staff had respectfully rearranged the room, and gradually, people began returning to their seats. The atmosphere had completely changed. Where there had been simple grief before, there was now a mixture of shock, anger, and pride. Thomas Mitchell returned to the podium, his hands steadier now. "I'd like to start my eulogy again," he announced, his voice stronger than before, "because I didn't truly know my mother until today. Eleanor Mitchell wasn't just a loving parent and grandparent. She was a warrior for justice who gave her life to protect others." Sarah sat between her mother and Jenny in the front row, holding both their hands. Through the windows, she could see more people gathering outside, families of other Sunny Grove residents, reporters, and police officers. The truth had finally come out, just as Eleanor had wanted. But this was only the beginning. Sarah knew that the real fight for justice was just starting, and she was ready to see it through, for her grandmother and for all the others who couldn't speak for themselves. The days following Eleanor Mitchell's funeral brought a whirlwind of activity that nobody in the family had expected. The Mitchells' living room had become an unofficial headquarters for the expanding investigation, with Detective Rodriguez making daily visits to gather more information. Sarah sat on the couch, watching the morning news with her parents. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Sunny Grove Scandal. 37 families come forward." The news anchor's voice filled the room. "In a shocking development, police have arrested 6 more staff members from Sunny Grove Nursing Home. Head nurse Clara Henderson and director James Phillips remain in custody, refusing to cooperate with investigators." The doorbell rang, interrupting the broadcast. Thomas Mitchell opened the door to find Mrs. Watson, whose husband had died at Sunny Grove 3 months ago. Her eyes were red from crying. "I had to come," she said, clutching an envelope. "After seeing the news. George, my husband, he tried to tell me something was wrong with his medications. I didn't believe him. I thought he was just confused." Sarah moved to the door, remembering her grandmother's diary entries about Mr. Watson. She had written about his sudden decline after complaining about feeling strange after taking his evening medications. "Please, come in," Sarah said softly, leading Mrs. Watson to the couch. More families had been visiting every day, sharing similar stories. Each one felt like another piece of the puzzle Eleanor had worked so hard to solve. Jenny arrived shortly after, carrying a stack of newspapers. The story had made headlines across the state. "Look at this," she said, spreading them out on the coffee table. 3 other nursing homes owned by Care First Holdings have been shut down for investigation. Sarah's mother brought coffee and tissues for Mrs. Watson, who was now sharing photos of her late husband. "The police want to exhume George's body," she said, her hands shaking. "They think they might find traces of unauthorized medications." The sound of more cars pulling up outside drew everyone's attention. Through the window, they could see news vans setting up their equipment. Reporters had been camping outside the Mitchell house, hoping to interview Sarah, but her parents had kept them away. "Sarah," her father called from the kitchen, holding his phone. "The district attorney's office is on the line. They want to talk to you about testifying." The word testifying made Sarah's stomach tighten. Detective Rodriguez had explained that there would likely be a big trial, and Sarah's evidence, along with her grandmother's diary, would be crucial to the case. Mrs. Watson reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand. "You're as brave as your grandmother was," she said. "Because of you both, we're finally getting answers." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Patricia. "Just gave my statement to the police. I'm sorry I doubted you at the funeral. Your grandmother would be so proud." The afternoon brought more developments. Jenny's father, a local lawyer, arrived with news about a class action lawsuit being filed against Care First Holdings. Families from all 4 nursing homes were joining together to seek justice. "The FBI is involved now," he explained, showing them documents. They found evidence of Medicare fraud, illegal drug purchases, and possible connections to organized crime. Sarah went to her room and sat at her desk, where she kept her copy of Eleanor's diary. She opened it to one of the last entries. "If anything happens to me, I pray someone finds this diary. These people must be stopped before more families suffer." "Sarah?" Her mother called from downstairs. "Detective Rodriguez is here with the state attorney's office. They're ready to take your official statement." Before heading down, Sarah looked at the photo of her grandmother on her desk, the one taken at her last birthday party. Eleanor's eyes seemed to hold a different meaning now, not just love and kindness, but determination and courage. The living room had filled with officials, police officers, state attorneys, and victim advocates. Mrs. Watson was still there, along with 3 other families who had arrived to give statements. "Ready?" Jenny asked, standing by her friend's side as always. Sarah nodded, holding her grandmother's diary close. The small leather book that had started everything, that had turned a funeral into the beginning of a fight for justice. As she walked downstairs to tell her story once again, Sarah felt stronger than ever. Her grandmother's last case was becoming something bigger than anyone had imagined, and she was determined to see it through to the end. 3 weeks after the funeral, the Mitchell family sat in the crowded courthouse, watching as Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Phillips were led in wearing orange jumpsuits. Sarah held her breath as the preliminary hearing began, marking the first official day of what the media had dubbed the Sunny Grove scandal. The courtroom was packed with families of former Sunny Grove residents. Many faces were now familiar to Sarah, people who had visited her house, shared their stories, and joined the fight for justice. Jenny sat beside her, taking notes on everything that happened. District Attorney Laura Chen stood before the judge, her voice clear and strong. "Your Honor, the state has evidence of at least 23 suspicious deaths at Sunny Grove Nursing Home alone, but this case goes far beyond one facility." On a large screen, photographs from Eleanor's diary were displayed. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as her grandmother's handwriting appeared, documenting dates, times, and suspicious activities. The evidence she had gathered was now the foundation of the entire case. The defendants were part of a larger criminal enterprise. Gay Chen continued, bringing up new evidence. Care First Holdings operated 4 nursing homes where elderly residents were systematically overdosed for insurance money. Eleanor Mitchell discovered their operation, and it cost her life. Mrs. Henderson's lawyer tried to object, claiming Eleanor had been confused and paranoid, but the judge shut him down quickly. "The evidence speaks for itself," the judge said firmly. The diary entries are clear and detailed, supported by photographic evidence, and now confirmed by our investigation. During a break in the proceedings, Detective Rodriguez showed Sarah and her parents the latest findings. We traced millions of dollars in fraudulent insurance claims, she explained. Your grandmother's detailed records helped us connect all the dots. Sarah watched as more former Sunny Grove staff members were brought in to testify. Many had taken plea deals, agreeing to tell the truth about what they had witnessed. A young nurse broke down crying as she described being forced to give residents unauthorized medications. If I didn't do what they said, the nurse testified, they threatened to destroy my career. But Mrs. Mitchell, she noticed everything. She pretended to be confused, but she was documenting it all. Thomas Mitchell squeezed his daughter's hand as they listened to the testimony. Mom would be amazed to see all this, he whispered. She never gave up, and neither did you. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around, trying to get statements from the families. Uncle Robert, who had become one of the most vocal advocates for nursing home reform, was giving another interview. This isn't just about Sunny Grove anymore, he told the cameras. This is about protecting all our elderly loved ones. My mother, Eleanor Mitchell, gave her life to expose this crime, and now we're going to make sure it never happens again. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Watson. Her husband's body had been exhumed, and the toxicology reports confirmed Eleanor's suspicions. Unauthorized medications had been found in his system. DHN approached Sarah during the afternoon break. We have some news, she said quietly. Dr. Phillips wants to make a deal. He's willing to testify against the owners of Care First Holdings. This could help us take down the entire organization. Jenny, who hadn't left Sarah's side throughout the hearing, started writing frantically in her notebook. She had been documenting everything for an article in the school newspaper, which had now been picked up by local media. Sarah, Jenny said, showing her phone, look at this. Other nursing homes across the country are being investigated now. Your grandmother's case started something huge. The afternoon session began with more evidence presentations. Financial records showed how Care First Holdings had profited from the deaths of elderly residents, collecting insurance payouts while cutting costs on proper care. Mrs. Henderson sat stone-faced as her former employees testified against her. Dr. Phillips looked nervous, constantly whispering to his lawyer. Their elaborate scheme was unraveling, piece by piece, just as Eleanor had hoped it would. As the day drew to a close, the judge scheduled the next hearing. Walking out of the courthouse, Sarah felt both exhausted and hopeful. Reporters called out questions, but she stayed quiet, letting her father handle the media. One step closer to justice, Thomas said as they drove home. Your grandmother started this fight, and now we're going to finish it. That evening, Sarah added another entry to her own diary, documenting everything from the hearing. She had learned from her grandmother that the truth needs to be recorded, preserved, and shared. The fight wasn't over, but Eleanor Mitchell's final case was finally breaking open, revealing a truth bigger than anyone had imagined. 6 months after Eleanor Mitchell's funeral, Sarah stood in front of her grandmother's grave, placing fresh flowers beside the new headstone. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the cemetery, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of nearby trees. The headstone was different now. Below Eleanor's name and dates, new words had been added. Beloved mother and grandmother, a hero who fought for justice. The change had been approved just last week, after the final verdicts were announced. Sarah wasn't alone at the cemetery. Her parents, Jenny, Detective Rodriguez, and dozens of families from Sunny Grove stood together, many holding flowers and photos of their loved ones. They had all gathered for a special memorial service, not just for Eleanor, but for all the victims. The verdicts changed everything, Thomas Mitchell said, addressing the gathered crowd. His voice was strong and clear in the morning air. Mrs. Henderson will serve 30 years. Dr. Phillips testified against the company owners, and now they're all facing life sentences. Sarah thought back to the final day in court. She remembered how Mrs. Henderson had finally broken down and confessed everything, how they had targeted elderly residents who had few visitors, how they had falsified records, and how they had silenced Eleanor when she discovered their crimes. Jenny, who had documented the entire case for what had become a nationally published series of articles, stood next to Sarah. She had won a Young Journalist Award for her coverage, but today she wasn't taking notes. Today was about remembrance and closure. Care First Holdings has been shut down, Detective Rodriguez announced to the group. All their properties have been seized, and the money will go to the victims' families. But more importantly, new laws are being passed. Illinois' law will require stricter oversight of nursing homes across the country. Mrs. Watson stepped forward, holding a large framed photo of her late husband. Because of Eleanor and Sarah, she said, wiping tears from her eyes. We finally know the truth about what happened to our loved ones. We finally have peace. Sarah watched as other families shared their stories. Uncle Robert had become the head of a new advocacy group for nursing home reform. Aunt Patricia was working with lawmakers to strengthen protection for elderly residents. Even some of the younger nurses who had testified were now helping to create better training programs. Your grandmother started something remarkable, Detective Rodriguez said quietly to Sarah. Investigations are happening nationwide. Dozens of corrupt facilities have been exposed. Thousands of elderly residents are safer now. Thomas Mitchell placed his arm around his daughter's shoulders. Mom would be so proud of how you carried on her fight, he said. You were just as brave as she was. Sarah knelt by the headstone, touching the cool marble. She remembered the day of the funeral, how terrified she had been to stand up and speak the truth. Now, 6 months later, that moment had changed countless lives. Jenny had brought copies of her final article, which featured a beautiful photo of Eleanor and detailed the full impact of the case. Look at this, she said, showing Sarah the newspaper. Nursing home reform bills are being introduced in 12 states. They're calling it Eleanor Mitchell's legacy. The gathered families began placing their flowers around Eleanor's grave, creating a beautiful garden of remembrance. Each person had a story to share about how the case had brought them closure or inspired them to fight for change. Sarah called Mrs. Watson. We have something to show you. She and several other families unveiled a plaque that would be placed at the entrance of what was once Sunny Grove. The building was being converted into a community center for seniors, with strict oversight and new programs to prevent abuse. The plaque read, "The Eleanor Mitchell Memorial Center, where every life is valued and protected." Below these words was a quote from Eleanor's diary. The truth, no matter how hard, must be spoken for those who cannot speak for themselves. As the memorial service concluded, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. The case that had begun with her interrupting her grandmother's funeral had grown into a movement that would protect countless lives. Ready to go? Her father asked gently. They had another appointment that afternoon, a meeting with state legislators who wanted their input on new nursing home regulations. Sarah nodded, taking one last look at the flower-covered grave. Yes, she said firmly. Grandma taught us that the fight for justice never really ends. There's always more work to do. As they walked away, the morning sun caught the words on Eleanor's headstone, making them shine. Her grandmother's final case had closed, but her legacy would continue to protect the vulnerable and give voice to those who needed it most.